Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to UCL for hosting this event, and before I hand over to your chairman, Tadj, and the speaker, I'd just like to explain how this seminar came about. This is a joint seminar between UCL Energy Institute and the Energy Institute, the body of the Energy Institute, and the special subject group within that, which is the IFEG, which I'm the chairman of. Now, I'll just say that IFEG is a group that works with the Energy Institute, just the data information, robust information, and use of information in the energy industry. So how people collect it, where we use it, all its uses and applications. So that could be green energy, reusable energy, renewable energy. So the IFEG is truly aimed at doing that. It's the professional side of the body, and I felt there's an awful lot of commonality between what the IFEG does and what the Energy Institute at UCL does. So this presentation has come together between the two bodies, and here we are today. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll just pass over to Tadj to explain where we come from.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so I'm Tadj, I'm the director of the UCL Energy Institute, and it's great to see so many of you here on an event to do with data and energy. Not two of the most sexy subject areas, but an area that is very dear to my heart, and I think very many of the people in the room today, but my colleagues as well. My background is that for the last 30 years I've been trying to do energy research in buildings, and try to understand how energy is used in buildings. But actually for the majority of that time we've had to do it with very little actual data about what the real energy performance of buildings is. And it's really been only over the last few years that sort of metadata has become accessible in any form for researchers or for other people interested in this area. And in fact we're sort of about to potentially move, in theory anyway, from a situation where we could have had total famine in this area to an absolute glut of potential information in the future with the introduction of smart meters, which will be collecting energy data, hopefully in a much more reliable way than historically we've been able to do that. But there are all sorts of challenges associated with how we can actually access and utilise that data in the best way. And it's great that we've got two excellent speakers today to explore some of these issues, and I'm sure at the end they will be only too interested to have some controversial questions about this subject area. What we plan to do is to have the two presentations and then questions and answers after the two presentations, and then that will be followed by a drink, which is just outside the lecture theatre. Before we get started, however, obviously we aren't planning to have any tests from fire drill. If there is a fire alarm, then there's a fire exit out here and to the right. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, which is Nigel Shadbolt, who is Professor of Artificial Intelligence and Head of the Web and Internet Science Group at the University of Southampton. He's got a phenomenal publication record, ranging in a whole range of different areas from cognitive psychology to computational neuroscience. But he is also now the co-director of the Open Data Institute, which has been doing some absolutely fantastic things and pulling together data sets, and has a great tremendous role to potentially play in this area. So Nigel, thank you very much. Cheers.
Okay, great. Right, so this will be a filmic experience because I've got lots of slides and just kind of visual a sense of the kind of visual impression rather than anything else. Who's only touched on open data before in this audience? That's great. So, this isn't kind of preaching to the choir then. Oh, that's because I plugged my iPhone 5 in. Right. I have a number of hats, and it's worth to declare. That's my day job, University of Southampton, professor running a group. But actually, I've been working for more than is good for any academic, a lot with government for the last 3 years, really, on the whole area of, we can think of it as data liberation, getting non-personal public data in particular out of government for wider public good. And I'll talk about that quite a lot because it's shaped an awful lot of where we are today, and I think in the energy sector there's an awful lot more we could and should do. I also chair a thing called the My Data programme, partly as a result of having been largely successful with the open data work with Tim Berners-Lee. They kind of thought, well, who's foolish enough to try and get not just data out of government, but data out of companies, consumer data, get it back to the consumers whose data it is. And so we've got some really rather interesting work underway in that space. I'll talk about that too. And that is my, for those of you who are social media inclined, that's the Twitter handle there. And I am the founder and chairman at the moment of the Open Data Institute, and that has very recently opened its doors, and I will say right at the end a little bit about what its mission and purpose is and what we're trying to achieve. Okay, various slides about deluge of data, kind of do you to death after a while, but it is still worth reminding ourselves about this wonderful phrase that owes much to research scientists at Google, the unreasonable power of data. And for those of us who were brought up, particularly in an AI tradition where you try to work out the model behind the data, in fact, you thought about the model first, it just doesn't seem reasonable that all of this terabytes and exabytes and zettabytes and megabytes of data should, in and of itself, be a good or useful thing. Surely we've got to do huge amounts of excessive analytics. And the other thing to say about this data deluge is that terms of art come and go, big data is on everybody's lips, it's a really quite distorting term. It seems to me unfortunate for lots of reasons. I prefer to refer to broad data, and it's to reflect the fact that there's big and small. Some of the most valuable data sets we've got out of government are Excel spreadsheets of modest size, okay? Because they make sense. They're the keystones for making sense of a lot of the big data assets. Public and private, open and closed, non-personal, personal, anonymous, identified, aggregate, individual, transient, patrimonial. So does it exist briefly, or are you committed through legislation or law to have to curate it through time? Is it stuff that is just a byproduct of what you do, that you haven't really thought that this data can have any value, or is it part of your core task to produce this stuff? Many variants, and if you look at the data released from government, you know, a little bit of a cluster diagram here to reflect the fact that it is a set of species of data. So it's really quite important that we don't have simple-minded descriptions of open data means they're going to get hold of my personal data and open it up for everybody to see, or that open data means that they've no interest in working with business on closed data sets, which are being collected at somebody else's expense. No, it's a complex space. And because this is a talk about the UK landscape, I thought I'd give you a landscape picture. This is quite a nice one. It looks like light probably from an orbiting satellite, might be. Actually, you will see immediately what this is. You see what that is? Okay. It's a map of London. There's the Thames, there are the bridges, there's the main thoroughfares. The relationship between that and that is that each dot, each pixel on here is representing the geocode of a Flickr upload. So that's a picture somebody's taken with a geocoordinate, and you just get that for free. This is a freely downloadable data set. At scale, that data shows what? It shows topology and structure. And more than that, people typically associate tags with that data. So the unreasonable nature of this open data set is that at scale, it shows me structure, and actually it will tell me the top most inspected and frequented tourist sites. It'll label them for me. So I can even get semantics out of this very raw data pretty quickly. So what are the exciting thing about data for me is its superabundance, of course, and trying to get the message over to policymakers and academics and researchers and economists about the excitement of not sexy, it's really sexy. Because these stories we can tell around that. And there is no better story, and some of you may have seen this before, it's an example I use. This is it's an example of data which people create intentionally. Okay, so that flicker data was an unintentional byproduct of doing something else. This is a map of Port-au-Prince, which was the Haitian capital. It was devastated by an earthquake, you might remember, in 2010. Just let me show you this brief example of the power of data. The reason I show this is because it's the power of particularly open data. So I'm going to go to a full screen mode and show you this. Now, this is a view of OpenStreetMap. It's not a very high resolution map. The truth was that before the earthquake there was no detailed map of this capital of Haiti, none at all. When the earthquake happened, a group of people got together, they repositioned satellites, got high resolution photo imagery, used OpenStreetMap, open standards, and the people on the ground began to upload the data from their GPS loggers as they got there. That was the earthquake happening, 14th, 15th of January. Those fluorescences are actually data uploads from people with GPS on the ground, walking the streets of this devastated capital, using open standards and an open source framework. In 12 days, they constructed, from nothing at all, a high-resolution map of a devastated capital city. So the crowdsourcing, the collection of data at scale, and what I kind of sends a shiver down my still when I see that, is that that product, which was an essential product for the humanitarian relief that followed, is the reason why, when we move from sector to sector, we should ask ourselves, what are the opportunities for us to crowdsource this data, to open it up, to make it more widely available? And there are many examples. The fascinating thing about the data revolution we're living through is particularly the user-generated crowdsourced component. And you know, there's an entire lecture in this. It's fascinating stuff. And some of you may be familiar with the citizen science movements, crowdsourcing people and individuals to do things like classify galaxies. You know, the Deep Sky Survey now is running out of galaxies to classify because individual people sign up to be trained to learn to distinguish these things, and they do it extremely well, better than computers. They're getting through tens of thousands of millions of images and becoming expert in their own right at doing this, through to actually solving more complex problems, such as working out protein folding patterns. Extraordinary that you can be trained to actually explore the space of potential protein folding structures for whose benefit is an interesting question in this case, but these are kind of tasks people are set. So the way in which data can be collected from the environment is also changing with the advent of wide-scale web-enabled capabilities. Okay, let's talk about some of the specific aspects of policy in the UK and what's been happening that mean that we are really in a very special place, I think, in the UK at the moment. About 18 months ago, last April, there was the release by Biz of a paper called Better Choices, Better Deals. This was about consumer empowerment. It was about the proposition that if you gave data back to the consumers whose data it was, you may stimulate a new kind of market, a new kind of interaction, a new kind of set of services. I have to say many companies remain and still remain deeply skeptical of this. It's like trying to explain the web to retail shops before the web existed. You know, what could that possibly do to our business model? We think there are many reasons that this is desirable, because fundamentally what we're seeing in this world is a move from well understood management of existing data assets that relate to individuals by corporates. You know, lots of business analytics done on your demographic, on what your propensity to buy is. The data controllers and processes, from that to something where the individuals themselves collect and manage their own data. And if we see it happening with our photo collections and our music and crowdsourcing to participate, why isn't this happening with the data we care about? Well, it is. It is in lots of niche areas. We see it coming very fast. Fitness data, if you're into fitness applications, you can see that beginning to happen very clearly. And the belief is that if we can persuade the companies, which include utilities, retail, banks, telcos, to name a few, to make their data about their consumers available back to the consumer securely in a machine-readable and reusable form, you will create, whether that's handed back to the individual and the individual aggregates into crowds or groups of various sorts, you will create new sorts of opportunity. And in fact, not just opportunity to those individuals, the entire interaction dialogue between you, a supplier, and the consumer can become much richer. Usually all businesses see are the downside cost of supplying the data. And it's a quite remarkable fact that by and large businesses are blind to the value, many businesses are blind to the value that they hold about they're happy to data mine it one way, okay, inside this, but the idea of having any kind of deep interaction over data health is still anathema. We have got areas where there are commitments to try and make progress. Actually, energy is one. There was, in fact, a meeting of the Big Six last November in number 10. When it gets cold, these things rise to the floor, of course, you probably all know. And this was all about you getting access to your basic tariff and consumption data online in a machine-readable way. Well, they're all committed to do it. I think one has actually delivered it at this point in some form. It's hard and difficult, they tell us, and expensive, but they are committed to doing it. We have got this sector to say it will. Now, what are the complexities? I could stand here and talk to you, and I'm sure our next speaker will too, about tariff complexification, obscurity marketing, confusion marketing. Do companies really want to reveal the true cost of something as basic as a unit of electricity and how much is consumed? Well, it's all much more complicated than that because, of course, the models are different. It's the same argument we have with telcos around the thousands and thousands of different types of contracts you can have for your phone. What we do know is that on average 30% of your actual telco tariff is unused, okay, on average. So from the consumer empowerment piece, there is quite a strong argument about trying to get individuals to a position where they can actually be more empowered. And there have been experiments. There was the famous one earlier in the summer where Which and 38 Degrees got together to try and do effectively a reverse auction on demanding energy. So the idea was a group of people would get together, sign up together, have similar energy demands, and go and collectively purchase gas from a gas supplier. There were hundreds of thousands of people signed up for this, pretty well, 240,000 I believe. It got whittled down stage by stage, and the large defeating element was the need to have to re-enter your data manually in these systems. And I don't know how many of you are active switchers, but the fact is that we don't have the friction removed from the process whereby somebody else has written the app that securely logs on to your gas supplier and can get the tariff and consumption data and then go to a marketplace auction. But this is actually not technically difficult. It's an organizational challenge and clearly proving to be a business challenge. But again, interesting developments in this area. For example, talk of, and people worry about things like disenfranchising people who haven't got access to the internet quite legitimately. Well, why don't we put a QR code on your utility bill that can contain all the basic information? You can go down to your library, get it scanned in your friend on your phone with their phone. There are ways to get around these problems, but fundamentally, the data has to be available to you to use as you see fit in a reusable format that is standardized, at least to make sense across a sector. That is a challenge. Ofgem's recently produced results of consultation around exactly the whole issue about simplifying tariffs in the energy domain. It seems to me that we are seeing movements here. Whether we have to regulate or do this in a voluntary fashion, I doubt this is something that might come into question. That is to say, there was a consultation put out by BIS just earlier this year to reflect on whether a power should be taken to compel large holders of transaction data to make that data electronically available back to the individuals whose data it was. A right to data, essentially. The government's committed to doing this kind of thing in some areas, like your health records, apparently by the end of the Parliament, but there is actually a bit of an asymmetry here. I think it's quite important that government does itself what it's asking companies to do. So why can't I get my tax record or my social welfare data or my educational transcript or my medical records of a whole variety of types back from the state who holds this data in my name? Well, that brings us on to the commitment of the government to a bigger data agenda in the UK, which is that of open data. And this is David Cameron's commitment to this at the beginning of the coalition government. Berners-Lee and I were working with the previous government who really initiated the data.gov.uk work to release data of various sorts. What's interesting about this is that the varieties of value unlocked. And the examples that we have now, the basic premise is that you open the data, and here are examples of data releases in the UK, everything from crime, reported crime, which many of you may have listed, police.uk, one of our releases we're very proud of in the UK, through to spending data from local authorities. This is the bus stops, the position of every bus stop in the UK. My famous quip on this is, there are 360,000 of them. It was a bit of a state secret, you know. How many of them do you think are where the government thought they were? Well, the answer is about 17,000 of them weren't where the government thought they were. And the great thing about that is that when this data was released, within a number of weeks, a site had sprung up to crowdsource the accurate location of where bus stops were. So we haven't quite worked out how government is to take crowdsourced data back into public ownership, but that's work ongoing. So open up the data and the applications follow. And that has been our experience, particularly in areas where the data is actionable, okay, where you can do something with it. And I don't know how many of you are probably now carrying around on your phone applications that get you around this city using open, free TfL data, transport from local data. That was one of the big breakthroughs. Actually, it was partly pioneered, I have to say, by the Mayor, Emma Coleman, and people in the London data store who were able to move more quickly than national transport infrastructures. You know, and we see some of the same impediments. When the franchises were let out to bus and rail companies, the data went with them. Despite the fact that huge amounts of public money go into rail and bus timetables, we have to fight to get the bus timetable and fare data back to be used openly by people to build these sorts of applications. But that's part of what the Open Data Institute's charter is, to get the value out of this data and to agitate for more of it to be released. It's happening not just at the city level, but at the level of cities and regions, not just at the nation state level, but at the level of cities and regions, and all around the world. So this has become, you know, the US began the process. We got in about 6 months after they had begun the process. We're rather proud of what we've released. There are literally many tens of countries now setting up their open data portal. It varies as to the quality and importance of what's there. I have quite a lot to say about that in other contexts. But it's all locked around this notion of open doesn't kill you. In fact, open really helps, because the open licenses I don't put any restriction on what people have to do. One of the things governments like to do is to lock down or impose a defined restriction in any data signage, like the data, except bring the government into distribution. Given the interest around spending data, using open standards is crucially important. I should say that in the UK, when we began this work, we didn't have even a license for it. So we never had a copyright. We now have the Open Government License, and it is an ongoing process to get government to look at its data assets and say, why isn't this released under an Open Government License? It's not personal, not a matter of national security. If I would have to give it away under an FOI, why aren't I? And in fact, as we'll see, that is now government policy. It's written down as government policy, whether it's government behaviour is a no matter. The power of these data sets, and as I say, sorry, I should say, finish this off, the data is an important part, but without these other components, without standards and licenses, you don't really unlock the value here. Open source isn't an essential part. You often see it as part of the participatory process. So the example with the Max, used open source software. And the benefits you get, the good thing about open data is that it doesn't just do one thing. It can, and depending on the political masters of the time, they will have different prioritization reasons for doing it. So everything from data journalism, the media often find the data interesting and intriguing, but through to the political requirement to be accountable and transparent. Issues around inclusion and poverty and diversity, often the early motivations from these data governments around this. But more recently, focusing on the fact there's a lot of value locked in the data itself. How long have I been going for?
Another 5 minutes.
Okay, so this is going to get very full. We see real examples where the data release makes a difference. MRSA, infection rates in hospital was published, and about, for the last 2 years, there's been an 85% reduction in the infection rates in our hospitals, in part because the league tables that showed how badly some hospitals were doing drove those hospitals to improve, share best practices, those who did better. Hard to prove the strict causal link, but it's an interesting correlation to say the least. Through bicycle accidents, automobile accidents that have actually changed the way traffic management's being used under pressure from people and activists, cycling activist groups who say, you know, these are shocking black spots, we should be doing more here. The UK has done a reasonable job in publishing data that matters. Okay, so far, it's published spending data. Every council has to produce everything it spends over £500 every month. Through to contracts, through to transport and environment. Crime data, reported crime data, my postcode in Southampton, these are antisocial behaviour and violent crime. That's my university just there, there's a little fringe around here. That's another month's data, that's another month's data. There is an issue, okay? This data is being used by insurance companies, by the police forces themselves to inform their behaviour. Lambeth by numbers, obesity rates in children, quite far amount of detailed data on an emerging health crisis over there, but being open about it. Now, I haven't put an energy data set up, and that is because there really aren't very. Okay, there's government kind of consumption data for ministerial buildings. There is a huge amount to do here, and it's a thing I feel quite passionate about. I mean, you know, if we can get data out on major arterial surgery rates and success rates, why can't we get our energy data out? From weather to chaos and so on. And this is quite an interesting slide. This shows you the amount of data sets we publish. Maybe the US boasts of 350,000 data sets, but it isn't data that people visit any more frequently than they do the 9,000 data sets the UK publish. There's something about being important to people's lives. We've gotten a survey to publish about 40% of its core data sets from postcodes through to geography. And there's always another data set to go. Our current interest is around the post office address file, which is the national address file, which would be very useful. Not who lives there, but the legal addresses in the UK. Massively useful as a potential economic benefit to the country. It should be found easily. There is a site that the UK has more to do with finding it. There's a lot to say about the technology to link data and represent data to make it maximally usable. And that comes back to my background in AI, looking at semantic web standards to do this. But we haven't got time to go into that. We are beginning to see that, though, happen, and the importance of having data authorities, labels that are reusable across a national infrastructure like your postcode, your company names, the particular providers, the cell phone, the location number, these things are extremely important. Talked about the change in behaviour. This is now government policy. So actually, public data will be published in reusable machinery files. Okay, so you hold them to account. Francis Moore is very fond of saying, we will have our feet held to the fire. Okay, and I believe he's absolutely sincere about that, but it's about getting ourselves organised to go and get the data that we know is there made available in these new formats. Because not only will it be good for our research, it's very good for business. These are some of the examples of companies who are thriving off the back of data releases open corporates who are harvesting now 43 million companies' details from around the world. Rather than taking these resources from Companies House, it would be a much more central position for Companies House to be publishing their basic data openly and freely, I would argue, because there'd be a lot more secondary value in the companies utilising that data. From health, GDP, satisfaction rates, through to parking, Parkopedia famously, where to find a free parking space, or not free, but one that isn't available, through to spending and travel, many examples. And we're looking at business models now. We're looking at how we can nurture environments. So this is my reflection on the fact that it's not just about government data, it's about, as I said at the beginning, we're generating data for ourselves. It's about businesses that have data assets that may be more valuable if they're published out openly than locked away. Okay. That may seem counterintuitive, but one of the lessons of the internet economy is that if you are looking to provide your service based on quality, you may well give substantial amounts of what was previously thought to be proprietary information out. There was a time when booksellers kept their stock lists secret. Okay. That got disrupted as buying went online. There are companies who publish substantial amounts of data about themselves, partly not just to encourage product innovation, although that happens with the fashion designers ASOS, for example, who publish all of the design online to get other application developers to innovate around it. But also companies like Nike, who had a bit of an issue with sustainable resourcing, as you remember, where they were getting their products made. They now publish a lot of that data openly to give a sense of what's going on. But this world is one in which personal, closed, and open data will start to form a complex ecosystem, but one that will generate value. And this is the Open Data Institute. It is located in Clifton Street, Shoreditch. We are open. We have Tim and I, both president and chairman respectively. We have our Gavin Starks, interestingly, ex of Amy, which was actually an energy oriented company. Is our CEO, Jenny Tyson, leading open data technologists, and Stuart Coleman, our commercial director, putting in place the next tier of individuals. We'll be up to about 15 individuals by Christmas. And we have our first 3 startups in residence. One of them, Mastodon, born out of a London Green Hackathon around providing clean cloud computing. So there are examples, but I believe the potential in this room, with the interest here, both to get more data out and to get demand stimulated for it, has got to be huge.
Including telecare and in particular energy, which is what we're focusing on today. Nick is the CTO of Onzo, which is a leading supplier of smart energy solutions, so we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
I'd like to talk to you a bit more in detail about smart metering. The UK is embarking on what's probably the most complex smart metering program anywhere in the world. The aim is to deploy around about 50 million meters. Every house will have a smart meter for electricity and a smart meter for gas. It is very, very ambitious. Now, I was going to spend some time talking about that, but 2 things happened recently that made me think that maybe there are some other things that might be worth sort of highlighting because they relate to that program. One of them is, give me a minute, I'll get there. There we go. Interesting one recently, we had Hurricane Sandy, and that's created quite a lot of debate in the industry because the US has spent about $85 billion over the past few years on upgrading its smart grid. As to what effect that may or may not have had on what's happened over the past few weeks. Interesting one is if you actually look at the states within America that have deployed smart metering, they're the ones in blue. There's a really big correlation that if you've got smart meters in, you weren't affected by the storm. Not a trivial one, but something like 81% of executives in the industry recently in the states who were polled said that the main advantage of smart metering, and smart grid, sorry, not smart metering, was being able to get better metering. Again, there seems to be a great lack of understanding about the data that you get from the system, what you do. It's very, very simplistic. The other really big thing that I think is useful that's happened, rather subsumed by the Sandy one, is Ofgem put out a consultation just over a week ago about the retail market review. And essentially this is about trying to simplify tariffs. Within the UK, tariffs are used by most of the utilities as a way of beating consumers around the head. It is all about obfuscation. We've seen immense complexity going into the UK programme. That now a lot of it is not based really on the customer benefits, it's based on tariffs. I'd like to highlight this. I'd like to recommend you go and read that because it's a real breath of fresh air in what's happening. So why do we need smart meters? Some of the reasons that people throw around, all sorts of various ones. It's actually one of the reasons that we're getting a complex system we have in the UK. Technology is being put into this by meter manufacturers that want to actually use it as a trade barrier to stop overseas meter manufacturers getting in. We're getting real complexity coming. Ofgem put a paper out recently looking at the mix of generation we have. They see the possibility of shortfall hitting as soon as 2015. So there's the argument, of course, that smart metering is going to be the next IT disaster, so we'll forget about the problems with the energy supply. It may be. Will it reduce the cost of energy bills? People tell us it will. That's one of the interesting ones. There's a big concern we're all about to rush out to buy electric vehicles, and we need smart metering in order to be able to manage the charge those. It does get us towards a big brother state in some ways, depending on what you do with the data, and that's one of the interesting things about data. All the other one, of course, is it saves money. Well, in order to get a program like this out, the government has to prove that it does save money. So, a little bit of audience participation here. These are 5 benefits that the government thinks we will get from smart metering. Savings because consumers will reduce the amount of energy. Savings because they won't have to send people around to read meters. Potential savings because of no need for customer supporting utilities. Because we now no longer have estimated bills, the assumption is people won't phone up, so you won't need to have all of the service stuff. There will be associated carbon savings because we're all using less energy. And finally, it's going to make the grid really more efficient. We won't need to build more power stations. So, who thinks that the first one, I'm just going to go through and say which do you think is the most important saving we're going to get out of this? Do you think it's savings from customer behaviour change? We're all going to change the way we use energy. Any takers for that? Couple. We're going to save money because we won't need meter readers. You cynical lot, you. We aren't going to have to pay for lots of people in call centres for you to phone up and query the bills. Couple. That will get associated carbon savings. How about the last one? We'll make the grid more efficient and we won't need to build as many power stations. They're actually there in the order that X thinks we will save money. There's a very inventive accounting thing going on, and the big one is that it's going to persuade us all to change our habits, and that's the way we're really going to save energy. So on the basis of that, I want to talk about customer engagement this evening, and how well the utilities A quote here I'm throwing up. C Prime is a US energy analysis company. They made some very nice comments in a report they did recently about what the killer application is for the smart grid. And their view is that the killer app is actually about educating people about energy usage. Most people, if you ask them what single item in the house that takes most electricity, probably can't say. It's going to be different for different homes. It's no longer really makes a lot of sense to go around and turn off phone charge. Even leaving TVs on standby. If you look at the power that TVs take nowadays, it's very little. What you do need to remember is if you've got an old one, because you've just bought a nice new LCD TV, you don't give it to the kids because it probably consumes 10 times the power your new one does. A fridge you buy today has about 1/10 of the energy consumption that was one that you bought 10 years ago. Yet most people, when they buy a new one, put the old one in the garage. The industry is doing very well with making appliances more efficient. And this is one of the really interesting ones of how do we actually talk to consumers. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how we talk to consumers and also how utilities talk to it. And this is the way most utilities talk to you as consumers today. They send you a bill. It intrigues me that they all publish guides to the bill like this so that you can try and understand the bill. And you just think, why didn't they make it easy in the first place? That's one of the things that Ofgem's pushing. But it's not a good way to engage Tariffing is something they really love. And the thing I really like, if you put the word tariffing into a Word document, the spell checker says terrifying is a bit. So SSE go out and sell tariffs. Most of them just say it's cheap. We sell on energy prices. Once that doesn't work, they go, let's do free gifts. Let's do free gifts. And what I really love is only pay for the energy you use. What else is energy that they think they're going to pay for? It does suggest to the industry that it possibly isn't set up to actually use data. But I did find a lovely advert from the 1930s, which does suggest. The thought behind this is all of the new energy-saving appliances like Hoovers means your wife can sit down at home and work herself out. I did rather like the approach. Interesting, if you look for energy bill cartoons, there's about 2.5 million of them, and I don't think a single one is actually being very nice towards the utilities. Recent surveys from DEC showed that only 6% of customers trust their utilities, and that's a number which goes down year on year. Big problem that utilities have is energy is energy is energy. Energy from SSE is no different from energy from producing gas. They haven't really worked out how to sell it. All they try to do is make it cheaper to switch, or rather not and tell you to switch anyway. They need to get to be more creative. Some of the things we've done as a company, working with the energy utilities, what I'm saying through the rest of this, I'm going to show off our products. I've got the opportunity, I'm saying. But if you go to our competitors, and Alert Me, the Owls, the Geos, we're all doing the same thing. We're all actually hitting our heads against the same brick wall of trying to get utilities to help educate customers. So, according to all the recent surveys by Consumer Focus and DEC and Ofgem, smart meter, quite a lot of them were given out to customers under the government-sponsored program a few years ago. It can be displayed, this one connects up directly to the around the east of the meter, and it tells them what the energy is. But for most people who get this, it's the first time they ever understand what the relative power consumptions are. They'll go around and they'll put different things on and they'll say, oh, that didn't make much of a difference, or, oh my god, I wouldn't do that. It's a really effective first start at customer engagement. But it's the first point of a journey. It's a toy that most people get really bored with after the first week when they go around and turn things on and off. So we think it's all about a journey of letting people understand what uses that energy, help them set targets if that's what they want to do, if they want to try and reduce their consumption. There are some people that won't want to reduce consumption. There was a very nice piece of work done over in California where they rolled out some of the smart metering information and gave people comparisons with their neighbours. And they found that a fair percentage actually increased their energy usage because they found they were using less than neighbours. And a really nice piece of work done on that found that almost all of those voted Republican. But you can bring in all of the behavioural research techniques out there of how do you make it compelling, how do you make it interesting. It's how do you get people interested in doing it, because unless it's interesting, energy is actually quite boring. Do the washing later, do whatever. And again, you see about a shift of 5% of usage doing that. Really interesting one is once people get engaged, they don't churn, they don't shift so much. With SSC, we've seen about 50% reduction in churn of users once they start getting information back and once they feel that they're being given some benefit. So there's some really interesting, simple things you can do, and that has nothing to do with how much you pay. It's just about education. Some of the other things we do is we actually look at the energy stream coming back. The devices we put out measure your energy every second. We record that, upload it, and we've probably got a database of now a couple of trillion energy readings at that high resolution. We can actually detect individual appliances and pull that out from a single feed. And we're just trialing this with some customers where they can actually look at their energy usage and we can say, this is what you're using at any one time. They get really excited the first time they see this, and then they say, but I know when I boiled the kettle. So the really interesting thing isn't so much detecting this, although that's quite clever, but it's then what you can do. You can start to profile how individual appliances work. We can see that if you get issues with either the door not closing or the door seals going on fridges where it starts to fill up. You can pull all of that together and actually produce a bill for somebody that says, this is how much I use for washing, that's how much I use for cooking. It's starting to make the energy bill more interesting for a customer. It's something they might engage in. So those are some of the things that we're trying to do with that. And as we said, we see overall, putting all of those things together, that you do get a real reduction in actual energy usage. May not be much, but it's a start. But perhaps the more interesting thing is what else you can get from some of this data. And this just goes on from, there's real value in data, and the interesting thing is it's all moving by itself. Not quite sure what's happening there. If you know what's being used, you get an idea of occupancy, who's in the house, when they're in the house. That gets useful when you start to put that into things like assisted living. We can see patterns of behaviour as people move around and use appliances. And you can actually relate that to memory loss, to things like urinary tract infections that cause memory loss, and use that to feed into other telecare services. We're using that, we're working on a couple of assisted living projects along with the TSB. And again, apologies for this, I didn't touch your list. But again, you can start to feed it in, and you can, it's the old thing about once you've got data, you can use it in multiple domains to try and make it more interesting. The other thing we're doing is, again, working on some TSB projects of putting it into heating controls so that we can understand when you're in the home and then actually adjust the heating so that it warms the house up for when you're there. Lets us understand a bit more as well about the thermal mass of your particular building, which again comes back to understanding how well buildings are being built. And that's just some of the data you can get on that. It makes it a lot easier to set up the thermostat. If I actually ever came across the person who designed my thermostat, I might kill them. That's a consumer-centric approach. What's the industry doing? Well, the industry, I'm afraid to say, just seems to be thinking about tariffs, tariffs and more tariffs. That's a simple one that that was, I think, Irish Energy put out when they were trying tariffs. History of tariffs is, tariffs are there very much for utility. We started off with simple things like Economy 7, you'd have a night rate, which was cheap. That came in largely because of some deals that were done with companies who made storage heaters. We're about the only country that has overnight storage heaters, but that came in with as a cheap night rate, you can do that, charge more in the day. In countries that have very big peak demands, we see that gets more complex. They still have a low rate at night to try and persuade people to do that. You then have a shoulder rate for most of the day and a peak rate at the point where energy is most expensive. If you're a utility, particularly if you're a deregulator, you have to go and buy energy, you have to pay for it, and the amount that it costs gets more expensive as you go into those peak periods. Power stations that can produce power quickly are expensive. They're either ones that pump water up hills and then let it run back down through turbines, or they're very high-speed gas stations where you can fire it up quickly. But they're expensive to run, typically because they only run for a small part of the day. So if a utility can cut down your peak usage, they save a lot of money. That's of interest to them. So we're now getting those rates, typically called critical peak pricing. We're seeing some sort of little bit of giving back by utilities. They do occasionally try and be nice to say that we'll let you eat as much as you like at weekend. There's actually a couple of experiments in the States of saying we'll give you free electricity at weekend. It'll be interesting to see where they go. All of this is very similar to what mobile phone companies used to do, of trying to have quite complex tariffs. Most have now gone to the eat as much as you want, and I'm really looking forward to the day when an energy company has the balls to do that. I suspect I might wait a long time. The other thing they like is something called block tariffs, and this is the one where, to begin with, for the first couple of 100 kilowatt hours, you get charged a low rate, and then if you get more, it's a higher rate, and then if you use even more, it's an even higher rate. It looks quite a nice principle, but it's really difficult to explain this to a customer. If you look at time of use tariff, then you know that there are points in the day when it is going to cost more. So it is quite easy to tell customers about that. The problem with block tariff is this accumulation generally runs across a billing period, which is typically a month or a quarter. So at the beginning, you're doing quite nicely, you're down at the bottom bit. And then as you get towards the end of the month, you suddenly discover you've used quite a lot. And at the point you get to the really end of the month, it's an absolute draconian rate. Now the issue with consumer engagement on that is, how do you actually know where you are during the course of the month? And when you get to the end of it, what do? You'll hear energy companies say, but it's just like mobile phones, sort of. But it's not like mobile phones, because on a mobile phone, most of the time it doesn't matter too much if you get to the end of the month. And even if you do get to the end of your allotted amount of call time on the month, you can use a landline phone, or you can even borrow somebody else's phone in the home. There's a lot of that actually happens as people get prepaid limits. I can't go and borrow electricity. And this is something that can really hit people if they get their usage just slightly wrong, and you can see you get a doubling of the bill. It's not a nice way of doing it. But after that, it gets even more complex. This is our normal usage during the daytime. There was a brilliant report that came out from DEC earlier in the year that was looking at the actual consumption and usage patterns in British households. And they went across a fairly large number of households, and breaking it down to exactly what people were using every part of the day. I haven't got the reference with me. If you want it, mail me. It is an absolutely brilliant report to show.
It's called Power Relation.
Yes, it is. Thank you. You can spend, or if you're like me, I'm probably somewhere down the autistic spectrum, you can spend absolutely hours reading it, but it's fascinating. But that's our average usage. If you look at that through the course of the day and say, well, what does that mean cumulatively? That's just sort of power ramping up during the day of how much do you use. It looks something like that. It's surprisingly close to a straight line for most users. Now this is where they get interesting, because they say, let's have these time of use tariffs, but as well as that, let's have different pricing blocks as well. Now, what does that mean? If you look at what it means, you basically have a 3x3 matrix. Every little bit has a different price, and depending on how much you use, at which point in the day, it gets allotted to different ones of those registers. Who thinks that's complicated? It isn't really, because the UK standard says you can have an 8x8 matrix. And you can change the levels at which those blocks hit in for each different tier, and you can have a different one of those matrices for every day of the year. This is what happens when you actually go out and let technology companies try and design smart metering standards. And that's what we have. It's going to result in products that are vastly more expensive than they need to be. It's got a complexity that I hope will never be allowed. It means it's highly unlikely that these products will be interoperable, which will increase cost. It's just madness. It's consumer engagement has been thrown away. It's a bit like saying, if you want to produce a human rights charter, you don't employ torturers and mass murderers to do it. They probably know all of the right details, but their heart isn't going to be in it. And the interesting one is, why are we doing it? Now, if you go to somewhere like Texas, and this is just looking at the usage throughout the day for an average Texas home, that's their electricity consumption. It's quite peaky. The only thing I haven't put on there is I haven't put air conditioning in. If you put air conditioning in, then it really goes mad. Now, in comparison in the UK, we don't have very hot summers, we don't have very cold winters, and our daily usage is pretty much like a straight line in comparison. Yet we are currently going out there trying to deploy the most complicated system in the world, with the most complicated tariffs in the world, for a grid that probably doesn't need it. So, call to action, I would really say go and read that Ofgem consultation report. There is so much that we can do if we can get user data out, feed it back to them, and start to educate and engage people about energy consumption. Instead of which, the industry seems set on finding ever more complex ways to beat us around the head. And at that point, I shall stop. Thank you.
Nigel and Nick to jump in and take some questions. I'll try and share the questions and answers. So we've now got about 15 minutes for questions and answers. And could you just introduce yourself very, very briefly before you answer the questions?
Tadj from the University of West Midlands. Can I just say a quick technical thing about the block pricing? It was, my understanding is that it generally goes the other way, and that they try and make people pay less the more they use. But my actual question is to Nigel, which is, how sensitive does data need to get before it shouldn't be released? So with MOT records, how close to someone's registered location can we get? With energy data, how close to someone's actual household can we get?
I mean, that's a very legitimate question. And I think there's this phenomenon called the Mosaic Effect, which is even when you don't have, quote, anything like personal data, the triangulation you get off of non-personal data sets says an awful lot about you. And we know that lots and lots of marketing companies make a great living out of microsegmentation. They know everything about you, except probably that they're not allowed to actually name you by name, but they kind of have you nailed. And the question, I think, is how we strike that balance. Now, it seems to me, for many of the open data conversations, then the privacy tariff, what's required is something that we have to have a constant conversation. We do with the Information Commissioner's Office around this. In fact, the crime data was interesting that we began that conversation with Chris Graham and his team and introduced this notion of a potential variable privacy tariff, that actually certain sorts of crime outcome were not in the same category as those which aren't shown at all. So, for example, domestic crime, domestic violence is not shown positioned on the map. It's other crime type. So you will have these discussions. You'll have them around some of the health data that's coming out. GP prescription data, for example, is detailed at the prescription level in terms of what's made out, how much, the drug type, but not, of course, to who. Now, you can, I think the balance also here is often people believe there's going to be a technological fix to this, so that I can anonymize it or use synthetic data and be sure that people won't be able to break it. I think that's not the way to be going. I'd much rather be going down accountability principles, which say, yeah, we made this available, and if you seek to de-anonymize and dereference and identify people and use it inappropriately, then we will come after you. And there is an ability to do that in some of the legislation. But it's a legitimate question. I think then the other part I would appeal to is consumer empowerment, and say actually the way to get over many of the big brother state arguments is to say, look, the deal is we will ask you to contract into this, and but it's your data, so you're the one who's going to make the decision on whether we can or can't get access to this. And I think great example is where it looks like with these devices, why just don't they make them available, where that port allows you to get your own data uploaded to something that you can use freely and availably, and you'll be the judge of who and what services you think might want to use that. But it's a legitimate question.
It's Prashant said Consumer Focus. I still have a couple of questions for Nick, actually, a question of comments. The question's really, you showed that the older lease was capable of recognizing the signature of appliances. I was wondering exactly how sophisticated is that? I mean, is there like a database of appliance signatures being built up, so you don't even need to have regular information?
We don't do it in the device, first of all. That information is transmitted back. We then do that on our own analytics servers. It's a set of algorithms we've developed over the years against a logged database of many, many types of different appliances.
Is that publicly available?
That's not, no. That's at the moment is sort of the value of the company. We don't.
My comment was, I've already looked at the workshops talking about the tax structures. And one of the things we tried at Rising Block Tariffs, we showed them the Californian example. I must say, people understood it very quickly. It was very easy to explain. They liked it, and they preferred it actually to unit-based charges by and large. So I'm not sure.
It's the complex ones where you mix time of use and block tariffs together that really worries me, and that's the way the industry is certainly going and talking at a technical level. But I just don't think it's all being driven by the fact of we can technically do it. It's a pure piece of technical masturbation with no real thought as to what does this actually mean to a customer and how is somebody going to adjust their usage based on it.
People saw it as evidence of closed paper. So the way California example works is that when it's 2 or 3 times the median consumption, then they're whacked. And again, it's the same thing with tax, really. You spoke about it.
Although there's a very interesting one there. California usage is not dissimilar to Texan usage. And there are times when there are very, very big peaks. If you actually look at modelling that against UK usage, which generally doesn't have those peaks, you can have some really unexpected pricing coming out of that for quite small changes to that matrix. The US one is a lot more obvious, and there's an interesting one in the US, particularly on the critical piece pricing, where they're now saying there are days when it's going to be so expensive, just turn your air conditioning off and go shopping or go to the cinema and use their air conditioning.
Michelle.
Michelle Shadbolt with the UCL Energy Institute. My question is kind of a Wikipedia versus Encyclopedia Britannica issue in terms of users kind of having a creation in the data process, and thinking particularly of the police data as an example, I suppose, any data set. And how might we sort of address the issue of the source of data, if you like, and the extent to which we might describe reliability or not?
Is your worry that there's an issue around the reliability of the data?
Well, and that sometimes user-created data, in some of the examples you gave, might actually be more reliable, and in other cases there might be cases where it might be less reliable. How might one judge?
I think we don't really have quite enough of a history of this. We do know something about the encyclopedic examples. In fact, there are quite good scientific papers on this, and it's more stable at the core than people would have thought, and higher error rates or lower. But at the extreme, the periphery, where the, if you like, peer review process, and there is one, as we know, the editorial authority is not in place, then wild things can happen. So I think that's an interesting question. We don't really know how to do Open Government Data 2.0, which is the right back.
David?
Yes, David Vincent. I'd like to ask a question about granularity. I might not be using the correct terminology because I'm a chemist and not a data expert. But the example is the Environment Agency published maps about your susceptibility to floods. And that's a fairly kind of crude level mapping. And there are plenty of cases where individuals have said, well, actually, we've never had floods in a generation, but you're going to put us in a position where our insurance premiums will be a lot higher. The same would apply in the crime situation, where if a locality has got high crime, not liability, but high crime incidents, but you've actually put your house into a orthodox category of security, but you're still seeing a higher premium. How does the individual, in those circumstances, and these are the examples, you can construct other ones, actually fight back against a system that has decided that that locality is the subject of an increased premium because the insurance company or the flood people think there's a greater risk, but the individual has tried his or her best to overcome that risk?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I think it's two things about that. One is it's an interesting mental exercise to ask yourself what happens to insurance markets as the ability to predict where the risk actually falls gets not distributed across the population but highly focused. Now we know that people have fought to legislate against that in the case of genetic disorders, for example, and medical insurance. But so there's a worry that if you stop being able to distribute risk, if your information is so good, what happens? And of course, yeah, what happens is that the market will revert to the information it thinks it has and will try and provide micro-analysis of your risk. And then the question will be, do we then adapt to the position where we have with driving, where, well, you will volunteer, the deal will be that you'll have to volunteer to show that you are up to standards that put you beyond or out of the risk category in some sense, assuming there isn't some European law that says that's discrimination, you can't do it. So using that driving analogy is quite an interesting one, where there are GPS trackers put in people's cars now, and people will give you a tariff relief on that. Yeah, I think it's I mean, the problem with flood data is, of course, that actually there's some really great data that's available at better resolution that they won't make freely available, and they bloody well should. Yeah.
Question, and then we'll go at the back, and then David, and then to the back as well. Okay.
Tadj from Kyoto University, European representative. I have a question about the Nigel about the how open data scheme. I think one is which countries or nations are most advanced in such a scheme, and which is the less advanced. And the other thing is so far when you have implemented such a scheme in the UK, the pattern has been the most a problem or obstacle or Protestant or challenge.
Well, yeah, a race helps. Okay, so the great thing is that everybody's at it now and trying to outbid each other. That's really good. So I think that the fact that we were in a bit of a race with the Americans for a while was good. Actually, it allowed everybody to kind of, and it's happening in all sorts of areas. You know, why isn't this data set available here? Why have the Danes got their post office address file publicly available and we haven't? So comparators help. There is clearly a sense in which many countries are moving quite swiftly to get to a basic availability to make this data available, and each jurisdiction has its own issues about what it's proving very difficult or quite easy to release. And so there is no absolute kind of set of insights about what does and doesn't work. There's best practice, and I think the UK, well, we've had political will, and it's a surprising thing to say. And I have to say, there's been a bit of, I hope it hasn't been a sense of official bashing, because one of the things that's made it happen in the UK are also a bunch of officials who have really worked hard to make some of those releases work. And I think it's quite important that we start to move to incentivization schemes within government, for example, where you're rewarded for data production and not punished or beaten up because it's a performance management.
Julian O'Halloran of BBC Current Affairs. I think the current estimate for the cost of the country of smart metering is about £11.3 billion, something like that. First of all, how realistic do you think that is? How many, if not, how many billion might we notionally add on to take account of over-optimism? And bearing in mind the answer to that, to what extent, what would be the payback time? Do you have a figure in your head for the payback time for the country as a whole? Because we're all going to have to pay for this.
Take this in order. 11 billion is certainly the last number I saw from an impact assessment, or just around that. I believe massive complexity has been added since that number was calculated. I don't know what that is. But I would certainly consider that there would be at least a 50% overrun on that. What is the payback? I don't know. One of the things that worries me is some of the original intentions I think were very valid ones. We've seen the industry largely lose sight of those in its fervour to roll out what it thinks is clever technology. And we are running a risk of having the momentum actually taking the system somewhere where it probably shouldn't be going. I think there are voices out there that are beginning to question that, but we have seen a lot of specification creep.
Just to add to that, I think, so I'm a huge advocate for data, but I think that for the very reason that's just been discussed, if you're generating this stuff and technology has gone mad and the demand is uncertain, then you really can be in a very difficult place. The evidence is that really quite routine consumption tariff data gives you enough resolution at a monthly level, even the Green Button Initiative in the US rolled out, gives you quite a lot of insight behaviourally that you can use in many of the sorts of tools you're talking about. So why aren't we doing something much simpler?
Thank you.
I was just going to come back to the discussion of flood risk. And actuaries already make a lot of assumptions about people in order to come up with insurance premiums. And my feeling would be that I'd rather they did that with a big base of data rather than just using mathematical models, which, you know, perhaps flawed. You know, if you've got actual real data to base your model on, your model is going to improve.
I think it's a great point, and it is rather disturbing to see just how powerful these data sets can be. The famous one that I like to quote is the Google flu trend, which was essentially a piece of work published in Nature where they were able to predict the outbreak, the real-time outbreak of flu in the West Coast by people's search terms. Previously, it had taken them 2 weeks to work out by reporting to the Centre for Disease Control that there was actually an outbreak going.
I've got a question regarding the incentive of the firm to actually increase the tariffs. How do you think you could incentivize the firm actually, companies, to do it? I mean, I actually doubt, you know, that, I mean, I agree that these universities put in better information and incentive to switch, for example. That might even something the company might do, because it's less expensive. But I think these block tariffs or these tariff combinations, there's a reason why they are there. You know? And I don't see how it could happen. There's a concerted effort going on on the company side to actually implement what you were suggesting.
I think the issue that we have with utilities is there is a mindset, which is that they supply an essential service and you have to pay for it. And energy is energy. There was a very interesting, somewhat flippant remark made at a conference in Australia that I was at earlier in the year, which I thought was a very nice one, which is that if energy companies actually understood the value of the data they could get from smart metering, they could give the electricity away for free. Now, that's going very much to another extreme, but it does point out there are other things in this contract that you have with your energy company that may be a source of value. And energy companies need to move from the position they're in, where it's just a case of we're providing an essential service, therefore you can pay for it.
Hi, I'm Luke Nicholson from Carbon Culture and formerly, coincidentally, founder of Onzo some time ago. Question each. Co-founder, I should say, for clarity, of Onzo some time ago. Question each. Nigel, the story of consumers owning their own data, of it being collected by other people and then gifted to consumers, is a great one that people have been talking about, including us, for ages. But it remains really unclear what that means. You know, when people say it belongs to the consumer, what does that actually mean? How will that play out in the new industries? I think perhaps in energy we've got a sense of how that might work through that device, but in every other industry it seems really cloudy. And if I can go on, Nick, to my question for you, you said that that the Onzo, the trials you've done, if I understood the graph, that you had saved 8% of energy across a population, which seems to be, I think DEC's estimates for the entire saving available from residential behaviour change run closer to 3%. So it does seem like you've got some uplift there. Could you speak more about that number and whether that's actually true and could be scaled across the population?
That's certainly the number that we've seen, and that's from about 60,000 users. Now, having said that, those were users who signed up to a tariff, which meant they got a free display, so there's some degree of self-selection in that. One thing that we have seen, which we think is a little bit different from some of the other studies, is a lot of people with an in-home display see that initial sort of 8 to 10% saving, but then after a couple of weeks it relaxes back up. One of the differences with ours is, as you know, is we're capturing that data and then trying to provide feedback to users. The users that do engage with that, and you can also engage by sending them out reminders every so often, do seem to keep that energy usage down. So it has to be an ongoing relationship. And I think that's why we've succeeded or done better than some of the other trials there.
But that is a population number you're talking about, that's not a peak.
No, that's population number. To be perfectly honest, we're not going to know until we get these devices out and into homes and see them there for a couple of years what it's like across the whole population. We do know from the ones we've got, we have a fair range of population from sort of young to elderly people. But the interesting one is that it tends to be that sort of 50 plus that you see the larger savings in. That's quite possibly because below that you're either not in, you're not paying for your energy, or you're just so busy with bringing the family up that you're really not got the time to think about it.
Just to your question about, I mean, how will we get them to care?
Technical. Could I just ask about these figures, whether they're electricity, gas, or total energy use?
That is electricity, I think.
Which is where the 10% figure will be much higher than the figures DEC produces for energy reduction.
I was just going to say, around the question about how we'll get them to care, I mean, without being too much of a technophile, I do think we're seeing the intercept, the slope on where mobile smartphones overtake your routine access to data via any other device or computers, and just seeing how much of the population is affected by that suggests to me that the devices that we'll see where the data will be, where you don't have to work hard to get this data delivered, it's incidentally being delivered as a byproduct of something else you're doing. And we see that in some of this health apps or some of the lifestyle apps where the data is being logged by the fact of what you're doing and what your movements are, or the footfall data that's being analysed as we speak by the telcos, who absolutely see the value in this data, you know, for footfall analysis around retail premises. We need to get to a position where the delivery to the device is so frictionless that the developer community can start to find value in vertical integration, for example. I mean, I think that's back to this issue that on its own, what we will start to see, I think is much more interesting, is as sectors have to get moderated together and aggregated together.
Hi, my name is Tom Packman. What do you have any views on a company that is seeing value here, which you'll know Nest in the US? Do you have any thoughts about the trajectory that they're taking with combining design, data capture, many services?
It's a beautiful device. I think the issue that I would have with it for wide-scale deployment is it very much sells to the same market with that large disposable income that buys the iPhone. I don't see an awful lot of data usage with it in terms of data being pushed out and used for anything else. What we really need is thermostats that work as well like that, that are connected, that you can buy for $15 or $20 rather than $250. The big issue there is actually getting installers to fit them, because almost every thermostat in the UK is fitted by a local installer. They buy it from the local shop and they'll buy the one that worked the last time. The industry has tried to push out more intelligent thermostats in the UK for the last 20 years, and they've all failed because they're just too complicated and too expensive to fit. Nest really got into that zeitgeist of people that had bought into the Apple model, but I think it's actually got a limited appeal in terms of how much of a market segment it is.
Aaron of my Institute for Sustainability. I wanted to ask about the new data that's kind of becoming available, because you mentioned there are these kind of 9,000 data sets. And I guess as a research economist, the thing that'd be interesting for us is being able to link data sets together. So you did briefly touch on the fact that you need keys, you need to have a postcode or something that links up these things.
But there's already a lot of data sets that people are using, and what would be useful for us would be to be able to take some of these new data sets that are becoming available and see how we apply them into existing data. So we have data on consumer spending, for example, at a household level that would be useful for us to have energy usage connected to that, because that's, when we're looking at something like fuel poverty or other related issues, it helps to be able to tie in these different bits of data.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think as a research economist, do you research economists? I mean, I'm also on a mission to get economists engaged with this new class of data. You know, how do you value the value being created by an apparently freely marginal cost resource? Because we're getting those demands asked of us. So it's a two-way contract. I think we do need to work. I shouldn't have been too. Things have really undergone a step change. But I can't pretend that the quality of data emitted is to anything like the level we want. I mean, vast amounts of the government data holdings are in spreadsheets, and spreadsheets that are unstructured, poorly documented, the semantics is unclear. There's a lot to do about upping the whole quality of data publication, and then persuading people to use stable identifiers. I mean, we are not at the stage where we've got a government that's able to reconcile what it spends against the contracts it holds with the companies, because there's no uniform reference to the corporations we pay and buy from contracting.
Last three questions. That one, question there, and then next.
Can I just to give a very quick, following on from the last question, a very quick advert for the DEC National Energy Efficiency Data Framework, which does link up household level consumption data with property data. And it's currently an internal government resource, and there is an aspiration to try and make some of that data.
So that's fabulous. I mean, so when I hear reference to those kind of data sets, all I want to know is when can we get it available as an aggregate government level, because it's there, it's fabulous, and we just have to push so that we get that stuff released. Yeah.
I led the project that developed that, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be released.
Right.
We anonymise the data by removing.
Well, there's a public bloody principle that says it should be. It's meant to be policy. So that's the question we have to. It's just knowing they exist.
I mean, some of it is household level, so it is something data which has to be
aggregated.
But it is potentially.
No, we removed the geography. We didn't aggregate it. We removed the geography.
Right.
So you still get all the details for research.
Hi, Adrian Ross, master student at King's College. I guess the question for Nick is, this generation of smart meters have the technology which allows devices to switch on or switch off at certain price points. And if it doesn't, why aren't we going to need a sort of smart meter 2 program at some stage in the near future, so we know to charge our electric cars when the winds blow?
The current smart meters being rolled out have the ability, or there's a variant of meters which will have additional switches in which can be remotely controlled. So in much the same way as that's used for storage heating today, the inference is that you can have a number of those devices that could be turned on or off for a number of circuits. There's no reason, given that the data can be brought back through a consumer access device, that you can't have a separate energy services supplier that will control a lot more around the home if you want. We don't see any real interest from UK utilities in controlling anything much more than storage heaters and maybe water heaters.
Doesn't seem very visionary.
I think you've just summed up the UK energy industry.
I'm Jason Palmer from Another question for Nigel. I've had a series of ongoing interesting rounds.
Yes.
DEC, ECLG, recently Canada's, also BRE, about the championship. It's not so very close to the what the issue brings. How can we assure those government departments that it will be so difficult to try to identify the faults that no one would really achieve that?
Well, I mean, there's a piece of work to do there and the ICO itself has these kind of impact frameworks, where you're meant to be able to go through this process. There is a real problem in a scarcity of technical confidence in the assertions made, and that's something that organisations like the OBI are there to help to do. I do think it is so easy to fall back on that, and yet the really good bar test is, would you release it under an FOI? Okay, what exactly is the worry and concern here, and can we have variants of licenses where the accountability principle is built in, which is quite an interesting, that happens in a lot of medical data sets where it is anonymized and openly available with the caveat that you shall not attempt to de-anonymize, okay? And if you do, you're in breach. That's not too onerous restrictions.
David?
Just again to Nigel, one thing that slightly concerns me about some of this stuff is that when we construct data frameworks through using certain linkage IDs like address, we bring together data sets collected at different points in time. Now, when we analyze that, unless you've got a deep understanding of the seasonality effects on different data sets, running cross-correlations on that data can lead to highly spurious results. How do we actually guard against that without a deep understanding of the underlying data?
I think you've hit on the whole fundamental challenge of data literacy, which is just being able to express that fact and recognize it to be an issue. So, if you will, frequency, periodicity, those elements which we see, for example, in the prescription data we're just analysing at the moment, you know, lovely kind of peaks in prescriptions you'd expect for certain classes of drug. The whole issue about understanding what you may or may not, and how you may or may not form a causal association, there is an interesting phenomenon in the transparent discussion of data. People say, this is terribly dangerous. In fact, a lot of the reasons politicians don't want to release it is they'll say, you know, people will misinterpret it. You know, what on earth do we think the process of contesting a story is, or an interpretation is? That's what happens, and has happened forever. And the really good thing is to have the discussion that says, for example, these consultant heart surgeon death rates, which were cause célèbre when they were published, had in some cases some things to do with skill levels, and in some cases a lot to do with those who were taking on the particularly difficult end of the market. So, you know, accounting for why you see variances is part of the interpretive act. My favourite example is a story from the Daily Mail, which claimed that Britain was the most heavily, densely populated country in Europe, and but it had forgotten, it had managed to take a number from Holland in which they hadn't taken out the bits that are underwater, yeah, you know, that was contested quite early on. There was a great data blog on it in another newspaper, and people said, you know, what a stupid interpretation. But we do have to guard against it, and we do have to think that along with all this data comes a demand for a degree of literacy. And I think that speaks to your point about engaging with users. And it may sound high-minded, but I think it's to be hoped and understood that people can understand exactly.
A quick follow-up on that. In light of the financial crash, which was promulgated by a failure to understand basic risk correlation in the financial markets, populated by the brightest and best analysts in the world, what confidence do you have that you won't meet that?
Well, Bob May's got an excellent talk on this as well. So, yeah, I can't argue for the perfectibility of this stuff, but I can argue that the strange thing about the data as it aggregates up is that some of the natural statistics just shine on through. So, but if you make the world so complex through second order and third order derivatives that nobody knows what the hell's going on, then you will end up with bad analysis.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. I think you've brought the questions to an end. Hopefully, Nigel will stay around. They've simply earned their drinks, I think. But hopefully, they'll join us outside for some further drinks and any further questions. So, I'd like to thank our two speakers for a fantastically stimulating presentation, and also the Energy Institute for hosting the event today. Thank you.